Thank you so much, everyone, for showing up. This is a huge turnout. We're all very happy. My name is Noah Perez. I'm working with John Logan. I'm the president of the Thomistic Institute chapter here at Ave Maria University. We work with a national organization in DC, and we bring speakers and lecturers here to AMU's campus. We also have different events throughout the year, such as retreats and sumo reading groups as well. And then John Logan is the president of the Von Hildebrand Club, which is more focused on the philosophical side of things. They have philosophical meetings every week. They host disputations and debates such as these and similar events. So please come to John, come to myself if you want to learn more. And we also have officers, spread throughout to discuss that with. So we're here for the disputation between Dr. Lenman and Dr. Federica on the ends of marriage. We'll start with a 15-minute presentation from each professor on their respective stance, followed by about 20 to 30 minutes of refutations, discussion. It will be just open conduct, open discussion from there. And then after about 20 to 30 minutes, we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A from the audience. I'll be the moderator. Pretty much I'll just make sure everything's going piecemeal, everything's going perfectly, and then I'll be giving the mic to everyone when the questions start. So if you could introduce with me Dr. Lenman and Dr. Federica.
So normally I would insist on ladies first, but the lady insisted that I go first, and so I oblige. I'm not going to be responding to Dr. Federica's position at this point. I'm just going to lay out a positive account because I want her to give her position, and then we'll respond in our discussion afterward. So we're talking about the ends of marriage. And of course, by ends here, we mean that in the sense of telos, as I understand it, which is not end as in the end of a line, but end as in purpose, the order of something, where it finds its fulfillment. And I'm just going to start off with this section from Denzinger, citing the Holy Office from 1944. It says, certain publications concerning the purposes of matrimony and their interrelationship and order have come forth within these last years, which either assert that the primary purpose of matrimony is not the generation of offspring, or that the secondary purposes are not subordinate to the primary purpose, but are independent of it. In these works, different primary purposes of marriage are designated by other writers, as, for example, the complement and personal perfection of the spouses through a complete mutual participation in life and action, mutual love and union of spouses to be nurtured and perfected by the psychic and bodily surrender of one's own person, and many other such things. In the same writings, a sense is sometimes attributed to two words in the current documents of the Church, as, for example, primary, secondary purpose, which does not agree with these words according to the common usage by theologians. This revolutionary way of thinking and speaking aims to foster errors and uncertainties, to avoid which the most eminent and very reverend fathers of the Supreme Sacred Congregation, charged with guarding the matters of faith and morals in a plenary session on Wednesday, the 28th of March, 1944, when the question was proposed to them whether the opinion of certain recent persons can be admitted, who either deny the primary purpose of matrimony is the generation and raising of offspring, or teach that the secondary purposes are not essentially subordinate to the primary purpose, but are equally first and independent, they have decreed that the answer must be in the negative. Okay, so in terms of argument from authority, the Holy Office from 1944 seems to indicate that emphatically the primary purpose of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Now, that being said, certainly the teaching of the Church has gone beyond just this saying, and most notably after this in the Second Vatican Council. And I want to propose a little bit about what's going on in the Second Vatican Council, where it certainly seems to at least teach a more expansive understanding about marriage and the ends of marriage. What I want to propose is this, that prior to Gaudium et Spes, the focus of the church's teaching here was focusing on sort of what is minimally required. What gets to the essence of the thing, so that you say there is a marriage. And this is why it seems to me canon law also has a vested interest in pointing this out. There's certain canons that say the primary purpose end of marriage is procreation. Why? Because canon law is interested precisely in that question. When is there a marriage, or when is there not? That's its. And when you try to give maximum allowance for there being a marriage, so what's the minimum requirement for there being a marriage as opposed to not? And it seems to me that that's an important thing for us to understand, because we have to be concerned with the validity of marriages. And so if there's a marriage where from the beginning is ruled out by the positive will of the spouses, they exclude procreation through either uses of artificial contraception or whatever else, that marriage is considered invalid, because it's missing the fundamental purpose of marriage. Now, what you end up, though, is if that's all you have about marriage, if that's all that your marriage consists in, okay, granted you have a marriage, but that's not necessarily an articulation of what a good marriage looks like. And I think in some ways, not in some ways, I think really what Gaudium et Spes is teaching, and it's more expansive teaching about the nature of marriage, is trying to lay out a fuller account of what marriage is. So I'll quote, marriage, and this is from Gaudium et Spes, marriage and conjugal love are by their nature ordained toward the begetting of children. Children are really supreme gift of marriage and contribute substantially to the welfare. So here it's affirming this. The God himself, who said, "It is not good for man then to be alone," and who made man from the beginning male and female, wishing to share with man a certain special participation in his own creative work, blessed male and female, saying, "Increase and multiply." Hence, while not making the other purposes of matrimony of less account, the true practice of conjugal love and the whole meaning of the family life which results from it have this aim, that the couple be ready with stout hearts to cooperate with the love of the Creator and the Savior, who through them will enlarge and enrich his own family day by day. So, and then I'll jump to one other paragraph. Marriage, to be sure, is not instituted solely for procreation. Rather, its very nature as an unbreakable compact between persons and the welfare of the children both demand that the mutual love of spouses be embodied in a rightly ordered manner, that it grow and ripen. Therefore, marriage persists as a whole manner and communion of life, and maintains its value and indissolubility even when, despite the often intense desire of the couple, offspring are lacking. So what Gaudium et Spes, as I see it, is not trying to undermine or deny the previous teaching handed down about the primacy of procreation as the end of marriage, but is rather trying to articulate that and place that in the context of a fuller understanding of marriage, because you certainly want to affirm cases where it's like, oh, if there aren't children, well, that's not, the church makes very clear, that doesn't mean that there isn't a marriage there. Further, marriage isn't only about procreation, even that's a principle, and that doesn't necessarily give you the recipe for what a good marriage looks like. Whereas what it starts to lay out about the continued growing and ripening of their relationship, the church is saying you need that in order to have a fuller marriage, and a happier and fuller life of the family with children, or without children. And I think that is a key point, and it shows that just because the church focused on sort of the minimum requirements before, it doesn't mean that the church is, in focusing on that, saying that's all that marriage is. Marriage is a lot more than that. However, it is important that the church does point out that what is fundamentally required, without which you don't have it. That being said, it's also important, and there's a Council Fathers saw fit in Second Vatican Council, Gaudium Spes, to also point out for the church to point to this greater and fuller understanding of marriage, and a more complete understanding, to give a fuller account of life, so that you don't have just like the base requirement for marriage, but you have a happy marriage, a healthier marriage, a fuller marriage, a holier marriage, which is not an unimportant thing. So I just want to say one word then about, I have time, yeah?
Yes.
Okay. About the idea of subordinate ends. So the fact that you have something as a primary end doesn't negate that there are other ends that you might be aiming, and it doesn't mean that those other ends become suddenly unimportant altogether. Okay? Again, if you want to emphasize what's necessary for something to essentially exist, what we might call a necessary and sufficient condition, that's something that's important to point out, but that doesn't mean that that's all the conditions for something to flourish, right? So you can think of maybe the Republic. The first city that Socrates builds with his in conversation is a very minimal city, and they point out, well, we don't want to just live this. We don't want to just simply live or survive. We want to live well. We want our relishes, and that's not a bad thing. That's not appropriate. Aristotle also affirms man desires not merely to live, but to live well. And so having secondary ends are properly articulated for the sake of establishing how something can be more perfectly what it's supposed to be. So it's not as if what is often said, the unitive end of marriage can't be seen as unimportant to a happy marriage. And in fact, I think you have to affirm that the procreative end is served, as the council does, by a robust fulfilling of the unitive end. But you also have to affirm the converse, that the unitive is strengthened and fulfilled by the attainment of the procreative end. But that doesn't mean that these things should just be taken as yin and yang or something, that you have either. But there is still an order to them. There's the primary end, as the church affirms, procreation. So why does the church affirm that? It seems to me that that's just rooted in the very nature of things. The whole purpose of that on the order of nature comes down to this, that we ought to we participate in God's eternity and his life on a natural means through the procreation of children. And that's a kind of a divinely given mandate and it's articulated in Scripture, be fertile, multiply. And that goes back to the very essence of like what we're supposed to do. That's our unique participation in God's own creative act, as Gaudium Spes says. Again, that's not the full articulation of what we want, but that's what marriage ought to be. But that's a sufficient articulation for what's required for there to be a marriage and what it's aiming at primarily. But if you want to talk about what's sufficient for a healthy society, etc., you need that, but obviously you need more than that. And that's, I'll end there.
I probably can't detach this right now. I can? Because
Yeah.
I'm thinking if I want to draw on the board, can I?
Yeah, let me
This out?
bring that over there.
Oh, I've
Well,
seen
I'll
this
try
right
to
now.
do it.
So I think that what I'm going to say is actually going to be maybe complementary to what Dr. Lendman says, although I guess he'll be the one to decide in a moment. And what I would like to do is, I'm going to come to the conclusion that procreation is the primary end of marriage and the spousal act. I'm going to be focusing on the spousal act especially here. But it's going to be the conclusion, and I want to give a slightly different framework, or maybe not a different one, but I would like to add something that shows how the two ends are integrated. Because what Dr. Lendman's account told us that the two ends are important. He told us about the order of those two ends. And I'd like to add now how those two ends are integrated with one another. That they're not just juxtaposed, they're not just side by side, but in some way there's an organic unity. So I'm going to use this board to write down what's going to be the key organizing principle for us here, which is love and the nature of love. So love is characterized, we put love here on the outside, so everything within the circle is encompassing what belongs to the very nature of love. It will be self-gift, so we can say giving, is going to be receiving, and this is going to be mutual. And springing from this giving and receiving is a fruit, and the first fruit is the new life of oneness that those who give themselves to one another in love, in a sense, rise up to. They die to themselves and now come to live for another and in another, really. And so they have a new life within themselves. And so in the abstract, we speak of giving, receiving, and fruit, and the first fruit being the union of the two. So, and I'm going to be using, by the way, an author by the name of Dietrich von Hildebrand. I'm speaking for the Hildebrand Club tonight. And so I'd like to, I'm going to be drawing on some of his ideas. So Hildebrand says that the motive for entering into marriage and into the spousal union is the love between the two persons, the love that they have for one another. So in a sense, we can say that marriage is the institution that governs, protects, nourishes the love between the spouses. So we could say there's a kind of infrastructure, juridical structure, which is marriage, and then its inner soul, which is love. And what we notice is that this juridical structure is an expression of the features of love, right? It supports the features of love. It's defined on the basis of the features of love. And then we find the same thing goes for the spousal act. In the case of the spousal act, what's actually going on? If we look closely at the spousal act, we of course can notice its procreative dimension. But and it's interesting to think about. I mean, I don't want to sound irreverent, but imagine if Adam and Eve did not know about the procreative dimension of the spousal act and they just entered into it. What would their experience and their sense of the spousal act be in the first instance? It would be an experience of union with one another. So the spousal act has the feature of being procreative, but it also has the feature of binding two persons to one another. And it's because of its essential intimacy, right? So the spousal act doesn't only have pleasure. We tend to think of the pleasurable and the procreative dimension, but there's another dimension, which is this unitive, intimate dimension. And in fact, what we know is that it's this act which consummates what is established in the vows. Have you heard that language before, of consummation? So the marriage is established, but it's not actually completed. The union is established, but not completed until what happens? Sexual self-giving occurs. Do you see that? And what's interesting about this is not just a union of bodies. It's a union of two selves. So a new ontological, is Ave Maria students can handle that word, ontological, having to do with the very being, okay? So something happens to the very being of the two, that oneness is completed. And it's very mysterious. Why doesn't a handshake do this? Have you ever asked yourself that, right? It's because there's an intrinsic property to sexuality whereby it is intimate, right? It dwells in the depth of our souls. In some way, body and soul intersect there. So when this bodily self-giving occurs, there's also a giving of one's very self. So we can't divide the body from the soul, the natural from the personalist. The two are very bound up in this case. Okay, so what happens is when we look at this act in the first instance, we find that it is absolutely loaded with meaning and richness already as an act of mutual self-donation. Do you see that? Okay, so, and we find out that the inner soul that animates this act is the spousal love between the two, right? In fact, the spousal act doesn't have union as its end. As John Paul II says, it is a realization of the union. It's an expression of the union. So when two persons are looking at one another that love each other and they're gazing into each other's eyes, they want to just be together. Would you say that gazing has togetherness as some end outside of it? No, you would say the gazing is the end, right? And it's the same thing with the spousal act. It doesn't have the end of union, it actually is a living of the union. In fact, it's a kind of incarnation of the union. So we find out that the meaning of this act is the expression and the living of spousal love. All right. However, I don't think I need this. However, what do we see about the essential nature of love? It's giving, receiving, and fruitfulness. And so Hildebrand says, once the two spouses enter into this act, and we can imagine a first time, and then few months later, or whenever it is, the spouses discover, I know this is a little bit of a kind of a funny way of putting it, they're surprised by something really wonderful that happens. The woman is bearing within herself new life. So now they discover that this act, which is so incredibly fruitful for their souls in establishing a union between them, now is fruitful in a very particular and new way. The coming to be of a new immortal soul. The fruitfulness of new human life. And of course, when they look at this act as a particular incarnation of love, right? Their union is incarnated in a specific way, and what else is incarnated in a specific way? The fruit is incarnated in a specific way. So now what we find is, in a sense, the spiritual reality of love descends into bodily being, shapes it from within. And so now what you have is sexual self-giving, giving and receiving, and the fruit of what? Of procreation. And so Hildebrand says, this act, which already has a meaning, a very rich and deep meaning as giving and receiving, we find that organically and in a sense inseparably connected to it is the incarnation of the fruit in new human life. And so he calls this a superabundant end of the spousal act. It's the same act which unites husband and wife is the one in which we find the creation of a new human soul. Now, we can see, is that some kind of nice coincidence? Is it a plan that God just decided to put the two together? And we see, no, in fact, in some way, it had to be this way. So for the human, the new soul, to have love as its source and origin, in a sense, it had to be placed in the giving and receiving of two persons to one another, if it was really going to have a love origin. Not just a physical act, which has the outcome of new human life, but an act which is an incarnation of love, so that the child's coming into existence, you could say it's ensconced in love. It's an incarnation. Its origin has love incarnate, right, in the exchange of persons in the sexual act. And so now we find out, of course, can you remove the fruit directly and deliberately without destroying the whole act as an act of love? You can't, right? The three go absolutely together, and together they form the one essence of love. And so now this essence of love is incarnated in this particular way. You see the inseparable connection there. So what I've done is tried to show how from within, the union and the fruitfulness are bound up by the very nature of love. And in fact, why do we call the child a fruit? What is it a fruit of? Do you see that? Fruit is a very specific metaphysical position. It's a metaphysical category for speaking of the origin of something. We can create something directly, or we can have something come about through something else. And that's in fact what the child is. How does it come about? Through the love, through the union, of the spouses. And what's symbolized here is, do the parents actually create the child? Do they put the gametes together? It's kind of amazing. The woman doesn't know when she conceives, does she? Nature takes over. And that's a picture of the fact that God is ultimately the one who brings into existence the human person. Okay, so I think my time must be almost up by now, but what I want to do then is I want to bring in a new way of understanding the child as the primary end of the spousal, of marriage and of the spousal act. Okay, so God, here he is in all eternity, alone, perfectly happy, and out of his generosity and love, he decides to create other finite persons who are going to now share his life of love with him, the angels. There we go. And then he says, as if his generosity and love wasn't satisfied, he says, I want to create more souls, but I want to do it by involving other souls in my creative love project. I want to incorporate them into my life of fruitful love. And so he says, I'm going to establish the institution of marriage. I'm going to create man and woman, and I'm going to establish the institution of marriage, and they are going to have children for me through their love for one another. And he, in a sense, that was his primary end. He wanted to have more souls. And he said, how am I going to do it now in this very complex way, so to speak, by associating others in his project of love. So just as we spring from his love now, the new child springs from the love of the parents. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I think that there's a number of things. So I guess I want to say, in many ways, I think there are deep agreements, and there might be just clarifying. I've often, my students, particularly who've taken sacraments, will know that I talk about in marriage, you know, it's done well. You start off, and it's as if you're gazing at each other, and she's gazing at you, you're gazing at her, or if you're a woman, it's vice versa. And you're gazing at each other, and seems to be nothing more intimate than that union of you and your spouse, beholding each other, and all of that, its richness. And then a child comes forth, and your gaze is drawn outward, right? And the modern world especially will teach us that, like, oh, see, isn't that sad? There's something that's come between you and your spouse. You're no longer gazing at each other, but you're gazing at your offspring. There's a deficiency in your love. But that's an inadequate understanding and fact. Because upon reflection, if you think about it, before you were gazing at each other, and that's wonderful unity, but there's two gazes, right? It's your gaze to the other, and then the other's gaze to you. But now when you're gazing together at your child, the gaze, what you're looking out towards there's one gaze. So you're even more united than you were before. And what are you beholding? You're beholding the fruit of your love. And you're beholding one another in your offspring. Right? And then when you see your offspring looking back, you see the fruit of your love sort of gazing back to you in love. And so, in fact, there's a kind of an exponential growth in love and fruitfulness in that. So it's actually profoundly beautiful. And I think that's incredibly important. And I think that it agrees really with your analysis that you gave. But what I get concerned about in this account is a normatization of the ideal. And that what I mean is that it seems to me that this is expressive of sort of the way things should be, but there's all sorts of times when what drives the conjugal act is, in fact, pleasure and a desire for pleasure. And now that's not necessarily a good thing on its own, but it's also not necessarily wholly bad in the sense that, as Thomas Aquinas points out, the reason these things are that you experience pleasure doing certain things is because it's the kind of thing you ought to be doing. Now you have to do it at the right time in the right place. So don't think that this is like, oh, well, Dr. Lindemann said I can fornicate. St. Thomas said, no, that's not what we're saying. That still could be morally deficient. But it is important to recognize that children can be the fruit of something less than this sort of authentic self-giving love. But the child is still an authentic fruit of the union. And I also want to leave room for something less than perfect in a marriage, right? That there's a certain amount of growth that should be allowed for. This is, I always fight people about Romeo and Juliet, right? People say, oh, they weren't in love, it's just lust. Well, the thing is the reason it's a tragedy is because Romeo and Juliet loved each other the way young people, 14-year-old and 16-year-old, are going to love each other. Not very prudently, rashly, wholeheartedly. The problem wasn't their relationship. The reason it's a tragedy is because their families were acting so stupidly that they weren't guiding this young couple in their love. That it put this couple in a situation where they ended up doing something utterly foolish and utterly tragic. But if their love had been given a better context, it would have grown. And it's like, yeah, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't this great desire for mutual self-gift. It was probably driven by hormones and things like that. That's okay. Why would you expect otherwise? They're 14 and 16. But we have to allow the imperfect to be drawn up into the perfect and not insist that the perfect be the only. And because there's a teleology even in the drive for pleasure. Even there's a teleology that we don't want to put aside. So you don't want to. It's not as if the fact that that the conjugal act is pleasurable is simply adjunct or unnecessary. I would say it's an essential aspect to it, because it's a sign from God that this is the sort of thing that you ought to be doing. Again, at the right time, in the right place, with the right woman. Or a man. It's gotta be. It's 2026 or 2025.
So thank you for that comment. I'm not sure I heard an objection there.
No,
but,
not really.
Maybe a little. Yeah, so maybe I can.
Just a concern, I guess.
Concern. Yeah. So maybe what I could do is clarify that what I was talking about is, what shall we say, the essential laws governing this institution and this plan, this project of God's. So we can distinguish between the essential laws that are governing something, and then whether or not we actually live up to them. And I think it's very important with what Dr. Lindemann says, in fact, that while we can know that love, and again, love is the inner soul of this and is the point of this, it's the beginning of this, it's supposed to be the end of this, and growth in love, it doesn't mean that it's always going to actually be fulfilled by the individual subjects who are entering into this. But I do think it's important to understand, for example, if we're told that we cannot directly separate the unitive from the procreative, meaning, as Humane Vitae says. It speaks of meaning and not of ends. We have to understand why that is. It's not just because we see a bodily or a biological event here whose natural outcome is the coming to be of a child. That is the case. But there's something much, much deeper that going on here, which is the unbreakable essence of love is being expressed in the biology. And so while the biology has to be respected, it's not as biological. So people will tell you that, oh, you Catholics are totally just slaves to your bodies. You have to, seriously, you have to follow the laws of biology. You're just like animals. So people have said that to me before. And I think what we have to be clear about is, no, what's going on is you have the unbreakable essence of love is being expressed in this situation. And there are necessary laws governing love. And if you, and this is what people witness to who use contraception. And I've heard many witness testimonies that when they interrupt this act, when they remove the fruitfulness from the act, they say, we were aiming for the union and we found that it fell apart. It slipped through our fingers. And I say, I can tell you why. I've drawn it on the board. It's because there's a unitary nature of love. And what I think Dr. Ledman is absolutely right. Now we have a goal to aim for. Giving and receiving. That's the goal. Not taking, right? But giving and receiving. And we do it imperfectly. And we grow in that slowly. And the marriage takes a whole lifetime. And I think it's a very, very beautiful point. And that is the danger with Dietrich von Hildebrand, is it can sound a little bit somehow, if you're not doing this, you're not living a marriage. And that's absolutely not true. I was just using him to kind of show what I think the essence of marriage and the spousal act is, and how the two dimensions or the two meanings of marriage and of the spousal act are united from within by the nature of love.
I guess I would like to follow up with just a question that, about essence. So I guess because you can at least posit a case where, like, oh, look at that couple. They have they're Humane Vitae couple, and they've got 10 kids. But the wife really can't stand the husband can't stand the wife, and they don't seem to love each other anymore. But they stay together because they've got kids. Now, I guess I would say, so when we're talking about what's essential to marriage, I guess, are they still married? I would want to say yes. I think you would want to say yes too. So granted that there's something defective in the relationship, they're not living it out as they ought to be, the marriage still exists, essentially, even if it's defective, in the terms that it should be loving. And that's, yeah.
Yeah, and the only reason we can judge it as defective is because we have our mind's eye on love. Yeah. And I would say this, then, not to turn this into a class on marriage and so forth, but love, of course, includes the affective side, and I'm sure that not everybody here would be in agreement with Dietrich von Hildebrand. He says that when it comes to certain realities of life, like love, the heart represents the true self in a very, very important way. So, for example, when you're choosing your spouse, you want to be in love with them, and God is speaking through that affective dimension, through the heart. He's binding the two together. But it's you could say the skeleton of this flesh and blood experience of love has to be the will, because in this life, the heart, the will, and the mind can be separated, and we know that the will is the only faculty that allows us to do what? To overstep our entire life and encompass our entire life. The essence of love is forever, isn't it? Can the heart live up to forever in this world? It can't. And so what we need an act of the will to overstep the entire life and say, I commit my entire life according to the essence of love, which is no matter how I feel, I'm living this love. And hopefully in heaven, somehow this will be redeemed and given back to us because of our faithfulness. So I think you're absolutely right about that.
That's a great conclusion.
If anyone has questions, we'll start the Q&A now. There's not a third mic, and I can't bring the mic to you. So if you could just raise your hand and I'll
Jack.
pick on you. Yeah, just speak loud, and I'll pick on you, and you can just stand. Yeah.
So my question is for Dr. Federica. When you were drawing on the board, I might have missed it, but were you saying that the child and the spousal act are two different expressions of the spouse's union and love, or are they, or is it one? Like, I'm a little confused. Are they two different expressions of love?
What are the two things? Can you repeat
Oh,
the two?
sorry. The child, the fruitfulness of the union, and then the union of the spousal act itself. Are they two separate expressions of love of the spouse?
Let me see, if I understand your question, I would say this, that Humane Vitae speaks of the two meanings of the spousal act, the unitive and the procreative. So there's one act and there are two meanings to it. And what I've done is I've refined that a little bit. What I've said is, can we say something more specific about their position and their order? And I think that the mutual self-giving of the spouses is one dimension of the act, and that happens in the bodily self-gift, which we know what it is, right? And then this overflows, the outflow, the inseparable, so to speak, irradiation, so to speak, of the mutual self-giving is the fruit of love. And in this case, it's incarnated in a very specific way, which is the coming to be of the child. So you have the fruit flowing from the union. And they're different moments, different dimensions, but they're part of something that cannot be separated. Yes.
Hi. I had a quick question. I don't know who to direct this to, but I'm wondering if, I know we talk in theology a lot about like the effect cannot be greater than the cause. And so does that apply here in any sense? Because the cause is the union, but then the effect is the child. So can that end be higher than the unitive end because it's the effect? Like coming from that cause? Does that make sense?
You said higher here, but you meant greater.
Yes.
Okay.
At least in a way, I see what you're saying, I think. But I think we have to be careful about equivocating on the union, because the union could just be, it doesn't have to be a perfect union, and it could just be any kind of instance of the conjugal act, even done in outside of marriage, when it's fornication or adultery or something of that sort. I think it is right that the effect that is the child is in a certain way disproportionate to the mere causes of the parents of the child. But that's why you need God to intervene directly to bring about the procreation. So, especially through the infusion of the immortal soul. So in a way, it is, but that's because it's of the spouses, the union of the spouses or couple, but it's not disproportionate to the effect, who is God. Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
By the way, if there's some poor, or wonderful, merciful soul who would bring down just another thing of red wine.
I think we had a question up here. Did someone here?
I'm thinking about my question now, and I'm not sure if it's even possible, but in this hypothetical where there is a situation where two people get married and the procreation of children is not possible logistically. Well, it's possible, but it's not like prudent logistically for a period of time, like 6 months or a year. Yeah, just like speaking to like, is that still a marriage? Because the end of marriage is the procreation of children, and that's not possible in that moment logistically. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to see how that would even be possible. But
Good question. Do you want to go first?
Go. I did that.
Well, so you're actually, in a sense, talking about whether what's called, I'm not crazy about the term, but natural family planning is legitimate, or whether it, in a sense, invalidates or undoes the marriage. Is that the question?
Right. So like its role, natural family planning's role, but like at the beginning of a marriage, where it'd be like 6 months. Like I'm not talking about like a 2-month situation, or like we can't afford a child, we already have 4, but not something like that. But like at the beginning.
Well, here's the thing. So for a marriage to be established, you have to determine the intent of the couple at the beginning, at the moment that they make their vows. And if they are open to children, we have to say a marriage exists. If later on they start defaulting on their responsibilities and they stop being open to children in a way that goes against the kind of generosity that NFP still requires, or the kind of openness, I should say, that NFP still requires, what happens? You have a kind of weird situation where the marriage is still established, but now people are sinning against the marriage that they've established. Does that answer your question? Is that what your question was targeting? Or
So kind of like they are open to children, but not at the moment that they get married.
Okay, so the church actually, now the church teaches that it is legitimate to take advantage of the times of infertility that God has actually implanted in the order of creation, that they may do that if they have, the church says, grave reasons. And I know that it's disputed, what does that mean? But if they have grave reasons, it even says for an indefinite period of time, they may actually do so. And now we're in difficult territory, because now you have what's going on in the hearts of the spouses and so forth. And even there, as Dr. Lendman says, they may use NFP selfishly at the beginning, and God is patient. He's waiting for that transformation to happen. They have to be praying for that transformation. Make us more generous if we're being selfish, if we're selfishly using NFP. Please help us to overcome that selfishness.
And there could also just be legitimate medical health reasons, right? You know, for who knows. Go to Bruno.
So this is Thomistic and von Hildebrand dispute, and I know you mentioned the heart. So are we to understand that you guys both agree that there is a third faculty of the heart, or is there a disparity there?
He wants to see a fight.
You're like St. Paul when the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Well, I think, Dr. Long, you had a serious question.
No, we probably don't agree about that, but I would say that the von Hildebrandian expression regarding the heart is pointing to something real. I would just articulate that in different terms, sort of philosophically, but I think sort of the reality that's he's expressing it, there's something real that he's pointing to, right? So I don't think it's nothing, and I think it's also important that we be mindful, especially as a theologian, of the long-standing tradition about reference to the heart and appeal to the heart throughout the fathers and Scripture. So you don't want to just simply set that aside as if you don't have to think about it. So there's nuance there. I mean, I'm sure there's also difference, but that's yeah. But I don't want to. We don't want to get into that here. That's fair.
Dr. Long.
Yes, I wanted 2 points. One of them is actually a minor correction to both of you. It's minor, but it's real. That it's actually not true that it's an absolute minimal condition for a sacramentally valid marriage that at the point of marriage there be an intent to procreate. Maybe he didn't say that, but I'm thinking of Josephite marriages, which the Rota adjudicated and said, in the very unusual case where a couple gives and receives the right over the body, each to the other, out of love, gives and receives that right over the body out of love, where God is calling them to some higher form of fruitfulness in the spiritual order, that a Josephite marriage is valid. So there can actually be a marriage, which is a valid marriage, where not by reason of contraception or by reason of refusing the gift of the body, that the couple is celibate. It's an extremely rare thing, but it happens.
If you go back and check the tape, the answer that I gave regarding that leaves open the possibility of Josephied marriage.
Good.
I didn't
All right.
bring in.
Excellent.
And
Excellent.
and the other
But,
thing is, from what I understand, is that it does require special permission,
Right.
which is a kind of tacit recognition of a kind of normative essence, which then requires a dispensation.
Well, it's interesting that in Josephied marriages, it's still required that there be the willing giving and receiving of the rights over the body as such, which is to say this is a union of a certain nature, and this is the second part of my observation and here a question. This seems to affirm a nature of matrimony that has a teleology. That is to say that there is a perfective good to which by nature this form of communion of man and woman that God has bestowed, was ordained, which is a perfection. And the only way in which one is out of that order is to be, by an unusual grace, elevated to a loftier perfection while still giving and receiving the very rights involved by the nature of the institution. So my question is, doesn't this require a unified teleology? Because if it proceeds from the nature of the union, we wouldn't, for example, say that a religious had a less perfect self-giving, or did not have the essence of self-giving in her life or his life, because not having an order to procreation. We'd say the order of procreation comes from the nature of matrimony. So my question is, can you hold what you're saying so eloquently, and it's beautiful, on the chart without a normative unified teleology, without the sense that by the very nature of matrimony, we're ordered to perfections of this kind, which granted they can be exceeded in certain ways in God's providence, but which are part of the ordinary life of grace for the multitude of Christians. I don't know if I'm audible.
No, you are.
I'm just not intelligible.
No, I'm just trying to understand whether you understood my presentation as rejecting a teleological.
No, I understood it as requiring it.
Oh, and you're asking me whether I agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think probably I would need to understand better what's meant by teleological. But I certainly think that my position safeguards what you want to safeguard by the language of teleology and by the concept of teleology. And so I know that's not going to be satisfying to you, Dr. Long, but
Well, no, that's good. I mean, we have all of these, ways in which we try to bring into acknowledgement the whole truth, which is hard to wrap our arms around.
Yeah, it might be that what's doing the work, the thing that's doing the work that teleology is doing for you might be done by something else in my framework, which is the essential structure of love, and it's becoming incarnated or embodied in the spousal embrace.
Doesn't it have an order to be incarnated in that way, though? In other words, before, in order to even be able to enter into marriage properly, doesn't that order have to antecede in some way? You say that that's why you're saying eternal essence.
Yeah, it has to be established. Yes, we have to be structured according to a certain structure, a certain way of being.
And some
Absolutely.
of these are spiritual.
Yeah, and if that's what teleology means, then I'll sign on the dotted line.
That's a good start.
Before everyone gets just eaten up by mosquitoes, please join me in thanking Dr. Lemon and Dr. Federico. If you have any more questions, I'm sure they'd be willing to answer
Yes,
them.
and I have bug spray.
Everyone needs to move. So, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
I got a natural bug spray. Everyone is right here.
What is it?